All right. Hello, fellow sapiens. Sit back, relax, and prepare to trace the earliest story humans ever whispered in winter darkness. Tonight, in Born from Darkness, we uncover how ancient cultures imagine the first fragile light of the year, the solar child, long before written myth appeared. This channel is soft science, quiet anthropology, and slow storytelling for tired minds who still wonder about the oldest ideas in the human archive. If you find comfort in this kind of calm exploration, a gentle like and subscribe helps other sleepless sapiens discover it too. And tell me, how do you listen? Before sleep, in headphones, during late work shifts? If you drift off, you'll find timestamps waiting for you. All right. Let's continue, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now picture a moment when the cold has lasted longer than memory, when daylight has thinned to a narrow ribbon at the edge of the sky, and when the horizon carries a weakness so familiar that every living thing feels it in its bones. Imagine a world before writing, before temples, before even the earliest carved symbols of belief, and yet illuminated by the same winter light we know today. In such a world, there is a point each year when the sun seems smaller, quieter, and less certain. The people who watched it were not astronomers, not priests, not storytellers in any role we would later recognize. They were simply humans trying to understand why the light seemed to fade faster than their fires. For reasons we cannot fully prove but see echoed across continents, many of these early observers began to imagine the midwinter sun as something young, not dying, not defeated, but not yet grown. We do not know when the first story took shape, but archaeological hints appear long before agriculture, long before settled villages, in the upper Paleolithic layers where images of animals, seasons and cycles show the earliest known traces of narrative thinking. In places like Chauvet, El Castillo and Capova, researchers note patterns of imagery that align with seasonal changes. Some scholars interpret certain repeated figures, small radiant marks, clustered dots, or animal forms paired with rising light, as early personifications of natural forces. The evidence is indirect, and most archaeologists caution against overly literal readings. Yet even within this caution lies a simple truth. These early humans were already turning the cycles they observed into symbolic forms. The winter sun, growing faint and slow to rise, offered one of the clearest metaphors they could have known. Across far-flung regions, stories recorded much later among Arctic peoples, subarctic hunter-gatherers, and groups living in extreme seasonal contrast, describe the sun as a being who weakens, hides, or must be rekindled at the darkest moment. These accounts cannot be mapped directly onto Paleolithic life, and it would be irresponsible to claim a single origin. Yet the global recurrence suggests that when light becomes scarce, humans turn to narratives of vulnerability. In societies that relied on the return of warmth to survive, it is not surprising that the sun was imagined as a fragile presence that must be cared for, protected, or coaxed back to strength. Many ethnographers who worked with non-agricultural groups across the 20th century noted that midwinter often triggered stories of a young sun, one who had not yet learned to take its full place in the sky. Linguists tracing proto-Indo-European roots find another echo. In certain reconstructed terms attached to brightness, dawn and youth, patterns appear in which light is described as something that grows, increases or matures. These linguistic threads do not prove a solstice myth, nor do they point to a universally shared belief. Instead, they suggest that ancient speakers reached for metaphors of childhood when describing the early phases of brightness. The line between description and narrative is thin. Once a society begins to imagine light as something that grows, it becomes easier to imagine light as someone who grows. Seasonal scarcity itself may have played a role. In regions where winter reduced food availability, communities often framed vulnerability in humanized terms. Ethnographic studies in parts of Siberia and northern Canada record stories in which the sun is spoken of as a child who must be helped through the darkest time, mirroring the real challenges infants face during the coldest months. These stories appear not as theological statements, but as emotional translations of environmental pressure. When the world dims, people imagine dimness in the language they know best. Comparative mythology brings another perspective. In several early traditions, from the Sami to certain Inuit groups, from early Vedic hymns to fragments of pre-Christian European lore, the returning light is described not as a triumphant god, but as a weak or hidden presence. The Indo-Iranian dawn goddess Ushas is portrayed as delicate before she ascends in brightness. In some early Celtic materials, rays of light are described as small, firstborn, or unready. And in parts of the Near East, pre-agricultural narratives portray the sun's return as a moment of risk, not certainty. None of these accounts can be taken as direct descendants of Paleolithic thought. Instead, they illustrate a recurring human instinct to portray the sun's weakest moment as childhood, as something incomplete. Light is not yet strong. It has not yet grown into the heat that sustains life. Realization comes softly here. The first myth humanity ever shaped was likely not about dominion or triumph or celestial power. It was about fragility. People did not initially imagine the sun as an all-powerful ruler. They imagined it as a being that needed time to recover, just as their own children did in winter. The archetype of the solar child, the small returning light, may not trace to a single origin, and scholars remain careful about linking distant cultures through lines that cannot be proven. But across evidence from art, language, and living tradition, a quiet pattern emerges. Before light was a symbol of greatness, it was a symbol of beginning. And when we look closely at those earliest layers of expression, the ones carved or dabbed long before anyone built a settlement large enough to cast its own shadow, we notice something quietly consistent. Many early images do not depict an overpowering blaze of daylight or a commanding solar disk. Instead, they lean towards smaller forms, a single dot held inside a larger halo, or a faint radiance tucked within otherwise unlit scenes. Even if we cannot claim these marks as direct metaphors, their distribution suggests that Paleolithic artists were attentive to moments of emergence rather than culmination. It is the beginning of light, not its height, that seems to draw their attention. In some regions, researchers have noted the presence of small engraved circles surrounded by larger, protective shapes, often placed near the margins of animal scenes rather than at their centres. These images never replace hunting or animal behaviour as dominant themes, but they appear frequently enough to hint at an underlying seasonal rhythm. A few anthropologists working in collaboration with indigenous knowledge keepers have suggested that these smaller circles sometimes echo the fragile sun at its lowest strength, though they emphasise the limits of such interpretations. What is more secure is that these motifs tend to cluster in contexts associated with winter occupancy or colder climatic intervals. Climatic reconstructions add another layer of context. During the final stages of the last glacial period, many regions of the northern hemisphere faced extended twilight in midwinter. Days shrank to narrow bands of illumination, and temperatures dropped quickly after sunset. Under such conditions, even a short-lived return of the light could take on psychological significance. The act of noticing the reappearance of the sun after its lowest point would not have required myth, but it could have invited story. People living in harsh winters would have understood vulnerability not through abstraction, but through daily survival. It is therefore unsurprising that some of the earliest mythic structures later recorded in much younger societies speak of a sun that is born weak and grows stronger as the year advances. Linguistic studies provide a quiet parallel. In several proto-language families reconstructed through comparative methods, the words relating to dawn or new light share roots with terms for childhood or emergence. This does not prove that Ice Age communities held a unified myth, but it does suggest that the conceptual link between early light and early life emerged independently across many ancient groups. The association between illumination and growth appears to be an intuitive pattern recognized long before writing stabilized meanings. Ethnographic evidence from societies that maintained oral traditions into the 19th and 20th centuries reinforces this tendency. In places where winters are especially long, the absence of light often becomes personified as a kind of fatigue, and the first return of sunrise after the solstice is described, in metaphor or narrative, as a young presence that must be cared for. These descriptions are not replicas of Paleolithic thought, but they reveal a stable human pattern. When the environment becomes difficult, people often imagine light not as a force, but as a being that must regain its strength. What unites these distant threads is the perception of fragility. For early humans, fragility was not a poetic device, but an immediate physical condition. The cold could break bodies, hunger could lengthen shadows, and the smallest warmth could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. A young sun, faint at the edge of winter, mirrored their own precariousness. It is here that the earliest mythic seeds likely took root. Stories did not arise to praise power. They arose to understand weakness. And to understand why this story spread so far, we must look where darkness dominates. Imagine a winter so long and so dim that the very idea of daylight begins to feel like a memory rather than a certainty. In those latitudes where the sun drags itself only briefly across the horizon or disappears entirely for weeks at a time, the human relationship with light becomes something far more intimate than mere observation. It becomes a bond of longing. Across the Arctic and subarctic, where long winters press downward like a physical weight, many of the earliest recorded stories describe the sun not as a powerful ruler, but as a being weakened by the season, a figure who must return from absence through struggle. We do not know exactly how far back such ideas reach, but the way they recur across distant languages and landscapes suggests that the near loss of light carved a deep emotional imprint long before written mythologies emerged. What if I told you that in several circumpolar traditions, the winter sun is described as something small, almost frightened, returning cautiously to the sky, as if unsure whether its place is still there? It may be tempting to read this as poetic exaggeration, but the pattern is widespread enough to merit careful attention. Among communities of the far north, the solstice is not simply a marker of transition. It is the threshold between endurance and relief, between a darkness that reshapes the body's rhythms and a faint illumination that signals survival. When ethnographers recorded oral histories in Siberia during the 19th and 20th centuries, they found recurrent references to a sun who behaves like a child lost in the cold, or a spark carried back into the sky by a careful guardian. These accounts cannot be projected directly into the Paleolithic without caution, yet their emotional structure shows how environments with extreme light scarcity can produce stories centered on vulnerability rather than dominance. A similar theme appears in certain northern Scandinavian narratives gathered in the early modern period, where the sun is said to retreat into a distant shelter during deep winter and must be encouraged or enticed to return. Some versions describe the sun as weakened by the long nights, unable to rise until restored by ritual action. Archaeologists studying seasonal sites in these regions have noted that winter gatherings often involved controlled fire displays, carefully timed at points when daylight was at its lowest. Such rituals are not evidence for a specific myth, but do show how communities synchronized emotional and practical responses to prolonged twilight. The fact that these gatherings often included redistributions of stored food suggests that the communal act of witnessing the sun's slow return was tied to shared survival. Paleo-environmental data helps us understand the context. In high-latitude regions, especially during periods of climatic instability in the early Holocene, winter days could compress into only brief pulses of light. Even when the sun appeared, it hovered at the edge of the horizon, casting shallow shadows across frozen ground. Under such conditions, the solstice would not have been a subtle event. It would have been a physical experience, the realization that the world had reached its darkest point, and that every day afterward would offer a fraction more light. It is in this space that myth tends to crystallize, not as entertainment, but as a way of translating environmental anxiety into narrative form. Some of the most striking parallels come from the indigenous peoples of the North American Arctic. In several communities documented over the past few centuries, the sun is portrayed as a being who can be endangered, hidden, or temporarily extinguished. In Inuit accounts, for example, the sun's absence is framed as a condition that requires communal action, observation, and patience. These stories vary widely and do not share a single origin, yet they demonstrate how the psychological pressure of near total darkness can lead to metaphors in which the sun is imagined as fragile or easily harmed. While these tales cannot be taken as direct windows into the deep past, they illustrate a consistent human response to environmental extremes. Light becomes relational, something that can be lost and must be recovered. Anthropologists note that across circumpolar groups, the return of the first true sunrise after the solstice is often described with language normally reserved for the arrival of a young or untested life. The light is said to be thin, hesitant, or easily blown away by storms. The emotional tone is rarely triumphant. It is protective. In these traditions, the sun is not reborn as a triumphant hero, but as a small presence that must learn again to ascend. Even when refracted through later cultural frameworks, the underlying pattern is clear. Where the darkness was deepest, the imagined child of light mattered most. This emphasis on fragility is not limited to any single group. When scholars compare narratives from Siberia, northern Scandinavia, and Arctic North America, they find echoes of an older, shared emotional logic shaped by the environment rather than by cultural exchange. Each tradition is distinct, but all are grounded in the simple fact that light deprivation alters human perception. In the far north, the sun's disappearance is not symbolic, it is experiential. And when experience becomes overwhelming, turning it into story becomes a form of resilience. The deeper we move into these high-latitude winters, the more we begin to understand how darkness itself becomes a kind of teacher. Archaeologists studying long-term habitation sites in northern Eurasia have noted that winter structures often contain architectural solutions designed not for warmth alone, but for orientation. Ventilation shafts, angled openings, and narrow slits cut into snowblock walls sometimes correspond with a first measurable glimmer of returning light. We cannot claim these features were symbolic in every case, but their careful placement hints at something beyond survival, an attentiveness to the thresholds between night and day, as if the architecture itself was waiting with the people for dawn to reappear. In some excavated semi-subterranean dwellings, thin beams of the first midday sun after solstice would have touched only a small area of the interior. To a community living through months of twilight, that faint illumination could have carried emotional weight far beyond its physical brightness. Ethnographers working in the early 20th century recorded descriptions of this moment in several communities, noting that people would pause their activity simply to watch the first returning light travel across the wall or floor. These accounts are not ancient, and we must treat them with caution, but they help us imagine how earlier cultures may have perceived similar transitions. The psychological relief of seeing the sun climb even a degree higher above the horizon may have been enough to inspire narratives in which the light behaves like a small being, gathering strength as the days lengthen. The social dynamics of the far north also deepen this picture. During extreme winters, communities often consolidated into larger groups for the coldest months, a pattern supported by faunal remains showing concentrated food processing during midwinter. In such conditions, shared storytelling becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a means of synchronizing emotion and expectation. When a group anticipates a long wait for the sun, the idea of light as an entity struggling to return becomes a way of giving shape to a collective experience. This is not speculation, but a well-documented anthropological pattern. When the environment exerts pressure on time perception, myth often emerges to stabilize it. Some researchers have also noted an intriguing linguistic feature in high-latitude languages. Metaphors describing light as something that grows, wakes, or moves like a being. These are not references to deities, but grammatical structures that personify seasonal change. Such linguistic tendencies do not prove the existence of Paleolithic myths, but they show how easily the human mind, when confronted with extreme environmental gradients, maps natural processes onto the logic of life cycles. A dwindling sun becomes a vulnerable presence, a lengthening day becomes a recovery. What is most striking is how consistently these metaphors appear even in regions with no direct cultural contact. Whether in northern Eurasia, the Arctic, or subarctic North America, the emotional signature is similar. The sun is imagined as something that can be harmed by winter yet survives it. This shared structure suggests not a single ancient myth spreading across continents, but a common human response to the same overwhelming seasonal phenomenon. Yet the same ideas also formed under very different skies. Imagine standing before a stone wall 10,000 years before writing will ever exist, and noticing a circle carved into its surface. It is not a face, not a map, not a tool mark. It is simply a round shape where no natural crack or weathering pattern would produce one. Picture it in the dim half-light of a cave entrance or beneath an open sky, framed by hands that lived in a world where every choice carved into rock required effort, intention, and time. What if I told you that this simple circle may be the earliest moment when humans attempted to give form to the sun, not as a god, not yet as a story, but as a mark that could survive long after its maker stepped away? We do not know the meaning the carver intended, but the evidence suggests that long before mythology gave the sun a name, the sun had already begun to acquire a shape. The earliest circular motifs in prehistoric art are not arranged like calendars or placed like diagrams. Instead, they appear scattered across rock surfaces, cave walls, and the faces of portable objects, concentric circles, spirals, discs, and ringed hollows worn smooth by touch. Archaeologists studying Neolithic contexts note that many of these motifs cluster in locations where the first rays of morning or evening sunlight would strike during certain seasons. It is not possible to confirm a singular motive behind these carvings, but their persistence across thousands of years hints at continuity. When the same shape appears in Iberian rock shelters, Scandinavian carvings, and Alpine engravings separated by geography and chronology, it becomes difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The sun is the one circle visible to every community on Earth. A recurring shape in stone may well have represented its earlier symbolic echo. In some regions, the imagery grows even more intriguing. Rock art scenes depict animals, horses, deer, and bovines, moving toward or away from a radiant disk. The animals themselves are rendered in familiar Paleolithic style, but the disk beside them is neither naturalistic nor random. It maintains a symmetry uncommon in engravings of the period, as if the carver wanted to emphasize a shape rather than an object. Some researchers propose that these compositions may reflect conceptual association rather than a narrative. Animal migrations linked to the direction of seasonal light, or behavioural shifts connected to the arc of the sun. We must be cautious here, because interpretive frameworks can drift quickly into speculation, yet the spatial relationship between these elements appears deliberate. If movement in the landscape depended on the sun's path, perhaps the animals and the disk were simply recorded together because they belong together in memory. Other discoveries add a portable dimension to this idea. Small stone plaques, bone fragments, and antler pieces from Neolithic and Copper Age sites sometimes bear circular incisions filled with pigment or polished to a sheen. These objects travelled with people, carried in bags or hung from bodies. Their size suggests intimate use, and their wear patterns imply repeated handling. While the true intention remains beyond our reach, a circular motif small enough to hold in a single hand invites interpretation. A disc carved into an object is more than a mark on stone. It is a shape carried through seasons, migrations, and lifetimes. Some anthropologists consider this evidence of early solar tokens, not religious icons, but mnemonic devices, reminders of something distant yet essential. Across cultures separated by mountains, seas, and millennia, radiant imagery appears with striking similarity. Lines extending outward from a central point, notched circles, starbursts, and ringed discs appear in context from the Eurasian steppe to the Japanese archipelago. Their distribution does not imply a shared origin. Instead, it reveals something simpler and more profound. When different groups attempt to depict brightness, they tend to arrive at similar visual solutions. The physics of light does not vary by region. When a human tries to draw something that emits radiance, a circle surrounded by lines becomes almost inevitable. The pattern arises not from a common ancestor, but from a common human experience of sunlight breaking through darkness. What strengthens this interpretation is not a single carving, but the continuity of the motif over long periods. In the archaeological record, circular symbols do not appear once and vanish. They recur across sites and eras, surviving technological shifts from hunter-gatherer mobility to the earlier settled villages. Even when communities adopt new artistic styles, the basic circular element persists. This is rare in symbolic evolution, where motifs often fragment or transform quickly. A symbol that reflects a persistent environmental reality, like the shape of the sun, holds longevity because the external referent remains constant. Whether a community herded livestock along river valleys or harvested early cereals in lowlands, this sun remained the same presence overhead. Stability in the sky helped produce stability in symbols. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Before humans crafted myths of deities or epic genealogies, before they spoke stories around fires about the sun rising from underground or emerging from the womb of the sky, they carved circles. These shapes did not yet reference characters or intentions. They captured a phenomenon, not a narrative. The earliest solar symbols function as silent precursors to later mythologies, visual prototypes that would eventually acquire personality, agency and history in later cultures. But their first purpose appears much simpler. They acknowledged a recurring presence, a shape that marked time, light, warmth, and orientation. It is also possible that these carvings helped stabilize memory across seasons. In societies without writing, externalizing knowledge is a challenge. A carved circle maintained on a rock face might have served as a reminder of a seasonal event or a visual cue that a particular place held significance during certain times of the year. Some sites contain multiple circles carved in vertical or horizontal sequences, suggesting that the motif was not always isolated. In these contexts, the repetition may indicate learning or emphasis. An elder teaching younger members of a group could point to the carved disc and reinforce knowledge about the seasonal sky. When the sun appeared at that point on the horizon, certain changes followed. Even without explanation, the mark offered a stable reference. Another layer of interpretation comes from examining the tools used to carve these symbols. Microscopic analysis shows differences between utilitarian marks, incisions made for cutting, scraping or shaping materials, and symbolic marks intentionally placed for visibility. The circular engravings often display careful, repeated strokes, sometimes executed with different tools to smooth or deepen the lines. Such precision suggests not only intention but care, as if the maker wished for the symbol to endure across years or generations. This contrasts with ephemeral marks, which reflect fleeting or practical tasks. If the earlier circles were made to last, then the idea they represented was meant to last as well. The archaeological evidence supporting continuity across millennia reveals a slow, steady shift from simple, circular shapes toward more elaborate motifs. Spirals begin to appear, often interpreted as dynamic representations of movement or cycles. Later, radiant lines are added, producing images more explicitly connected. This gradual enrichment mirrors another human behaviour, the tendency to imbue repeated shapes with personality over time. A symbol seen often enough becomes familiar. A familiar symbol becomes meaningful. A meaningful symbol becomes storied. The cross-cultural parallel suggests that early communities recognized the sun as more than a physical object long before they created myths in which it acted with intention. The earliest carvings contain no characters, yet they contain the seed of what characters would become. A shape that stands for light does not speak, but it hints at a relationship between humans and the sky, a relationship that would eventually take narrative form. The realization that these early carvings may be the first attempts to give form to sunlight does not diminish their power by labeling them primitive. Instead, it shows us how myth begins, not with elaborate pantheons or formal doctrine, but with quiet, repeated attempts to record something the eye sees every day. Before stories were spoken, they were carved. Before the sun had a name, it had a shape. And before the mythic child of light entered the world's storytelling traditions, its first silent ancestor glimmered in a circle etched into stone. In time, these symbols became characters. Picture a world where the cold months were long enough to thin a village to half its number, where stores of fat and dried meat dwindled weeks before the first thaw, where even the strongest hunter's breath fogged the air in ways that signalled strain rather than strength. Now imagine watching the sun crawl so low across the horizon that it seemed to skim the edge of the world, giving barely enough daylight to finish the simplest task. In such a world, it is not surprising that many cultures imagined the sun not as a warrior or a king, but as a child born at the coldest moment of the year. What if I told you that across continents, languages and millennia, this idea, the newborn light, appears with a consistency rare in early mythic systems? We don't know who first imagined it, yet the evidence suggests that the motif of a vulnerable sun was one of humanity's earliest attempts to explain why the darkest moment of winter was also the moment light began to return. Across Indo-European traditions, Andean highland narratives, and Near Eastern conceptions of cyclical renewal, researchers find variations of a simple theme. Midwinter gives rise to a fragile being of light. In many Indo-European reconstructions, linguists identify a root metaphor associated with new brightness or infant fire. These terms appear in later Vedic hymns, where a young glowing presence is born at dawn and again at the turning of the year. They also emerge in Celtic texts preserved much later, where winter solstice marks the birth of a youthful figure whose strength grows as days lengthen. And in Iranian traditions, the return of a light after its seasonal decline is represented through the emergence of a tender luminosity rather than a mature force. These are not identical myths, and the cultures that recorded them were separated by long distances and long histories, but the recurrence of a childlike solar figure is striking. The Andean record offers a different but compatible pattern. High-altitude communities in the central Andes preserved oral traditions that speak of a small, faint sun emerging at the lowest point in its cycle, gradually strengthening as it climbs toward longer days. Ethnographers working in the 20th century noted parallels between these narratives and seasonal rituals timed with the solstice. Although we must approach these comparisons carefully, because the Andean stories belong to a much later period than the earliest Indo-European material, the logic echoes the same environmental truth. During the coldest time of year, the sun behaves like something that has been diminished, something needing to awaken or recover. The Near Eastern corpus preserves its own version of this concept. In early Mesopotamian texts, the sun's disappearance and return are often framed not as a straightforward death and rebirth, but as a kind of periodic depletion, followed by renewal. While later myths personify this process through more elaborate narratives, the seasonal framework underlying them is older. When the sun stands at its lowest power, the world feels weakened, and the return of light becomes synonymous with the rise of something small, still forming, still finding strength. Comparative scholars caution against drawing lines too directly between cultures, but they agree that the idea of a fragile newborn light recurs in regions with seasonal extremes. The linguistic evidence adds another layer. In several Indo-European daughter languages, reconstructed metaphors describe light as something that grows, ripens, or matures. The earliest forms of these expressions appear in poetic or liturgical contexts, suggesting that the habit of imagining the sun as a being with developmental stages is deep-rooted. One term associated with dawn in Vedic material can be translated as the young one, and in some Germanic languages, winter solstice traditions preserved ideas of renewed light as if it were being brought forth rather than merely observed. Linguists emphasize that metaphors of growth appear widely across languages for many natural phenomena, but when tied consistently to the winter turning point, they offer insight into how ancient people conceptualize the sun's behavior. Seasonal cycles shaped narrative structure in ways that go beyond metaphor. When the solstice marked the point at which daylight would finally begin to lengthen, communities living close to the limits of subsistence needed a conceptual anchor, a reassurance in the midst of uncertainty. The narrative of a child emerging at the darkest moment provided that anchor. The child represented possibility. It embodied the fragile but growing promise of warmth and safety. The story did not claim that winter ended with newborn light, only that from this point onward, loss would gradually give way to gain. The alignment between astronomical behaviour and human emotion created a narrative symmetry. The sun's weakness mirrored the community's own vulnerability at winter's edge. Another theme appearing across these mythic structures is the idea of the sun resting or sleeping before returning. While some of these accounts belong to periods long after the earliest traditions were formed, the conceptual pattern is consistent. When the sun slows its arc and appears to pause near the solstice, the 3 days of stillness noted by many early sky watchers, the natural interpretation is not one of retreat or defeat, but of conservation. In agrarian societies, rest before renewal is a familiar cyclical pattern. But even in pre-agricultural communities, the concept of an exhausted or quiet sun makes intuitive sense. The light seems diminished, the days contract, and the world cools to its deepest point. From this context emerges the idea that the sun, like a child, must regain strength. Comparative examples from Vedic, Celtic, and Iranian sources reinforce this continuity. In Vedic hymns, a youthful solar presence appears in contexts tied to renewal and cyclical return. In Celtic traditions recorded centuries later, a divine child born at midwinter grows in power as the days lengthen and is later challenged by older forces at the turning points of the year. In Iranian lore, the concept of a returning light is woven into narrative of cosmic struggle, but the earliest layer still reflects a simple understanding. Light diminishes and must be restored. These cultures are separated by geography and history, yet they perceive similar seasonal patterns. It is the environment, not direct cultural transmission, that generates the shared theme. This pattern is not limited to Eurasia. In circumpolar North America, stories speak of the sun's weakness during winter and its gradual strengthening afterward. While these narratives do not always use the image of a child, they preserve the same emotional structure. The sun is at its weakest precisely when the world is most difficult to endure. Once again, the environment shapes the metaphor. When daylight grows scarce, the sun appears diminished. Its return offers relief. The image of a young or recovering sun, whether framed as a child or as a small spark, reflects a universal emotional response to the winter solstice. Understanding this archetype helps illuminate why the child of winter appears so widely across early mythic systems. It is not merely a poetic invention or a theological symbol, it is a reflection of human life at the boundary of survival. The child's fragility mirrors the thin margin between endurance and collapse during the coldest months. When communities awaited the return of the sun, they did so with the same mixture of hope and apprehension felt toward any vulnerable new life. The metaphor became powerful because it aligned with lived experience. The recurrence of this motif does not imply a single origin or a unified ancient religion. Instead, it reveals something older and more foundational, a shared psychological response to an environmental pattern that shaped human existence long before writing or doctrine. The sun, weakened at midwinter but destined to grow, mirrored the experience of children born into harsh conditions. They were fragile, dependent, and impossibly precious because the group's future rested on them. A child surviving winter meant continuity. A sun emerging from its lowest point meant the same. The elegance of this parallel is not accidental. Early humans lived close enough to the edge of winter scarcity that the survival of a newborn child and the return of the sun were both moments of cautious joy. To imagine the sun as a child was to express gratitude in a language older than myth. It recognised that strength begins in weakness, and that renewal often starts with something barely noticeable. And from that fragility came the earliest heroic tales. A world in which the sun's strength rises and falls like a breathing giant, where the year feels less like a calendar and more like a creature moving through cycles of weakness, loss, trial, and hesitant return. Picture the earliest humans watching this change not as an abstraction, but as a drama unfolding above them, one that became too familiar, too patterned to ignore. What if the first heroes we ever created were not modelled on people at all, but on the sky itself? We do not know for certain when humans first began mapping their inner stories onto the world outside, but the evidence suggests that by the late Neolithic, many cultures had already woven the sun's yearly arc into narratives of descent and return. This is one of the quiet revelations of comparative mythology, the moment scholars realise that the stories we call heroic often follow the same curve as the solar cycle. The light wanes, the world cools, the days shrink. Then the low point arrives, a moment of near extinction, a kind of death stitched into the calendar, and then very slowly the sun begins to rise again. Strength increases, warmth returns, life reawakens, the hero survives. The recurring pattern appears in many traditions separated by oceans and millennia, though its expression varies with each landscape. Some myths speak of an underworld journey, a literal descent into a place of darkness where the hero is stripped of strength and status. Others describe battles against shapeless forces that can only be defeated once the hero recognises a hidden truth. A few place the hero inside the belly of a monster, or inside a cave, or within the roots of a cosmic tree, enclosed spaces where the world seems to pause before opening again. These stories resemble the years-long arc of fading light and gradual renewal so closely that modern scholars often describe them as narrative mirrors of solstice and equinox. We do not need to assume direct borrowing to see the similarity. Seasonal cycles would have been an inescapable presence for societies without artificial light or modern insulation. In many regions, surviving the cold months required careful resource management, shared labour, and deep communal memory. The return of daylight after midwinter was not merely a pleasant change, but a turning point that shaped whether a group lived or starved. It is understandable, then, that myths began to follow this same structure, from decline to lowest point to renewal, because humans were living inside that rhythm every year. The information we have points to a wide geographic spread. In Indo-European traditions, for example, stories of heroic descent and victorious return appear in early poetic structures. In the Rig Veda, a text composed long before the 1st century BCE and drawing from an even older oral landscape, there are references to figures who battle through oppressive darkness and emerge renewed at the turn of the season. In Old Norse materials, though preserved and written down in medieval manuscripts much later, scholars recognise echoes of archaic seasonal patterns, a weakening power descending into a world of shadows before rising again with greater force as the year turns. In ancient Greece, some of the earliest mythic fragments speak of figures journeying into realms below, only to return transformed, mirroring the arc of the sun from declining autumn to reborn spring. Across the world, in the southern Andes, early mythic cycles associated with the Inca tell of a solar presence withdrawing, suffering or hiding during the cold season, then reappearing with new vitality. In parts of ancient Near Eastern tradition, scholars have identified stories that match the pattern of a god or hero facing decline and rising again in early agricultural festivals. Although the details vary, the underlying structure is startlingly familiar. a waning power that reaches a low point before ascending once more. Some linguistic studies reinforce this continuity. Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor of many Eurasian languages, suggests metaphor clusters that pair youth with new light, growth with increasing brightness, and weakness with diminishing warmth. These are not definitive proofs, but they hint at a long-standing cognitive relationship between the sun's movement and the way early speakers described strength, vulnerability, and renewal. It is possible that the first metaphors for power came from nothing more than watching how daylight expands and contracts. The seasonal logic embedded in heroic timelines is often overlooked. Many myths position the hero's trials during the dark or dangerous months of the year, placing the lowest point, the symbolic death, at the moment when the sun reaches its weakest. Then, as the hero regains strength, the daylight in the natural world increases. In traditions where ritual calendars survive, festivals marking a hero's triumph or symbolic resurrection often occur not at midwinter itself, but slightly afterward, when the sun's return becomes unmistakable. This delay matches the natural curve. The solstice is the turning point, but the early days after it are still dim enough for the change to feel fragile. Modern scholarship, beginning in the 19th century and evolving through the 20th and 21st, has occasionally described this universal pattern with the term monomyth. But long before it was formalised, humans had been shaping stories around the same contours. The idea that a figure must lose something essential, pass through hardship, and then return strengthened is not a psychological invention alone. It echoes the yearly script written across the sky. A weakness is acknowledged, a descent is endured, a return is hoped for, then witnessed. It is important to be cautious here. None of this demonstrates a single origin for hero myths. Instead, it points to convergent thinking shaped by the natural environment. When sunlight behaved the same way every year, communities face similar challenges at similar times. Over generations, the repeated pattern likely invited narrative reflection. People told stories that made sense of what they were living through. Light decreases, and so does strength. Light grows, and so does power. The structure became familiar enough that it persisted even when its ecological origins faded from memory. Archaeological evidence supports the continuity of seasonal storytelling in indirect ways. Sites aligned to major solar events often show signs of ceremonies or gatherings tied to specific times of year. In some regions, the months after midwinter show concentrated traces of communal feasting, ritual deposits, or symbolic objects deliberately placed within built structures. These gatherings may not have been linked to named heroes in the earliest phases, but they reflect a shared concern with vulnerability and the gradual return of light. Later myths, already shaped by storytelling traditions, would embed narrative characters into what had once been simple seasonal observances. Ethnographic studies also show that societies living in environments with significant seasonal contrast often develop stories that mirror these cycles. Among pastoral and hunter-gatherer groups documented in the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers repeatedly observed narrative structures that follow the same arc. A figure loses strength or becomes trapped, passes through a time of danger, and returns renewed. These examples are not evidence of ancient origins on their own, but they demonstrate how environmental pressures can produce similar storytelling patterns independently. Once these patterns became familiar, they would have been transmitted through families, communities, and expanding cultural networks. Over centuries, stories grew more complex, layering metaphor, character, and divine agency onto a simple underlying shape. The earliest versions may have contained no heroes at all, only a recognition that the world itself followed a rhythm that could be anticipated. But as human imagination deepened, it became natural to place a figure inside that rhythm, a being who descends, a being who struggles, a being who returns. The hero's journey, then, began not as a tale of triumph, but as a reflection of the sun's quiet endurance. Modern interpretations often focus on battles or quests, but the archaeological and comparative evidence suggest the earliest versions were more modest. They emphasize vulnerability, loss, and the unlikely return of strength after a moment when everything seemed at risk. For communities living through cold seasons where survival hovered on a narrow line, the weak midwinter sun must have felt familiar. A small, struggling force that nevertheless grew into the vibrant heat of spring. The realization embedded in these myths is simple and profound. Humans were not merely watching the sky, they were learning from it. They found structure in its movements and allowed that structure to shape their earliest narratives. Before analysis, before formal theology, before epic poems, there was the sun. And its patient cyclic journey gave humans a story longer and older than anything written down. There is another layer to this pattern that becomes visible only when looking across very long spans of time. As communities became more settled, the practical need to explain the year's most difficult period deepened into a more reflective search for meaning. Hardship alone did not produce the heroic pattern. It was the effort to understand why the world weakened before it recovered. Archaeologists studying ritual deposits in temperate Europe note a subtle but telling shift during the late Neolithic. Objects placed in pits or beneath house floors often cluster around the turn of the year. These deposits do not depict stories, yet their placement suggests that people were marking a threshold moment. What stands out is not triumph, but transition, a point at which the familiar becomes uncertain before stabilizing again. This structural concern echoes the core of the heroic arc, the idea that a journey must pass through a moment of absolute vulnerability before transformation is possible. Some of the oldest rock art sites in Eurasia reveal a similar sensibility. At a handful of locations in the Caucasus and Central Asia, faint engravings show figures standing at the edge of a chasm or beside a descending pathway. These motifs, difficult to date precisely but likely from the early Bronze Age, do not align with any known narrative, yet their placement suggests that descent, not ascent, was the moment people chose to represent. Researchers argue that these scenes may mark a cultural awareness of thresholds, boundaries between seasons, or states of being, or visible and invisible worlds. Whatever their purpose, they highlight an early fascination with the turn toward darkness, rather than the return to light, reflecting a worldview that saw importance in the low point of a cycle rather than its outcome. Linguistic anthropology adds another dimension. Some early poetic structures in Indo-Iranian traditions include a form scholars call a reversible sequence, a narrative that moves from decline to recovery, but emphasizes the turning moment rather than the final state. These structures appear in verses describing weather cycles, animal migrations, and even the behavior of rivers at seasonal extremes. When later heroic stories were set into these poetic frameworks, they inherited that same central pivot, the moment when everything changes direction. This pivot is also the pivot of the solar year, the point where the sun's descent halts before its ascent begins. The match is striking, not because the stories describe the sun explicitly, but because they replicate the rhythm of a world shaped by its movement. Even in regions where the solstice is less visually dramatic, such as equatorial zones, the same narrative pattern sometimes arises. Here, the cause seems less tied to daylight itself, and more connected to rainfall cycles, monsoon shifts, or ocean currents. The structural resemblance remains. Forces diminish, reach a low point, and then rise. This suggests that the heroic arc may originally have been a response not to a single celestial event, but to the broader human experience of cyclical vulnerability. The solstice simply provided the most visible and universally shared version of that cycle. In this way, the earliest heroic journeys were less about triumph and more about orientation. They offered a way to understand the shape of time, the movement of seasons, and the fragile continuity of survival. And although later myths would layer battle, morality, and divine purpose onto these structures, the underlying shape, decline, nadir, return, is older than any named figure. The fact that this shape appears across unrelated cultures suggests a common cognitive grounding. Humans everywhere learn that the world changes direction, and so, over generations, their stories did too. But heroes alone could not explain why light behaved this way. Imagine a moment when people first realized that the world did not simply grow dark and bright at random, but moved between two states that pulled against each other like slow seasonal tides. It is difficult for us, living with electric light and constant illumination, to understand how strongly ancient communities felt the boundary between what belonged to day and what belonged to night. Yet in the archaeological and mythological record, there is a quiet consistency that appears again and again. Long before duality became philosophy, long before it hardened into symbols of morality, early societies understood the year as a dialogue between two forces that lived side by side. One was the growing light, the one who returned after the winter solstice. The other was the keeper of darkness, the weight of the year's decline. Neither force was imagined as evil, neither was imagined as absolute. Both were necessary, and for reasons that emerge from ecology rather than ideology, this pattern appears in places that never contacted one another. What if I told you that duality did not begin with abstraction at all? The evidence suggests that it began with simple observation. When one part of the year warmed, the other cooled. When one direction brightened with sunrise, the opposite direction lengthened in shadow. When one wind brought growth, another brought danger. Across early cosmologies, the world was structured not as a hierarchy but as a balance. In many Indo-European traditions, this balance is reflected in linguistic parallels between the bringer of dawn and the holder of night. Dawn deities tend to be associated with motion, renewal, and the first light that breaks the horizon. Night deities tend to be associated with stillness, memory, and the slow passage of unseen time. These oppositions, reconstructed cautiously through comparative linguistics, likely reflect seasonal contrast rather than moral judgment. The winter solstice itself sits at the pivot between these two principles, a hinge that marks the moment when one force begins to retreat and the other begins to rise. A similar pattern appears in East Asia, where yin and yang, long interpreted as philosophical abstractions, may have earlier ecological origins. Several scholars have proposed with suitable caution that the earliest forms of this duality mapped onto seasonal rhythms, yin associated with lengthening darkness, cooling earth, and stillness, yang associated with rising light, warmth, and growth. These correlations are not symbolic inventions layered onto the environment. They seem instead to arise from sustained observation of how landscapes behave across the year. The important point is that duality here is not framed as conflict. It is not a battle, not a cosmic war. It is the recognition that both halves of the seasonal cycle are required for the world to function. We can see echoes of this same understanding in parts of the African continent, where complementary pairs appear in oral traditions across regions. In several West African cosmologies, creation involves two cooperating principles that must be held in balance for life to flourish. Some traditions pair heat and coolness, Others pair movement and rest, or dryness and rain-bearing winds. Although the details differ widely, the underlying logic remains consistent. The world is made by contrast, not by uniformity. And in many of these traditions, seasonal cycles, not metaphysics, offer the earlier scaffolding for this duality. Dry seasons and wet seasons shape agriculture, travel, ritual timing, and communal expectations. The solstice still plays a role, though in subtler ways, as a marker of celestial orientation rather than temperature. The year is felt through shifts in sky position, in the angle of shadows, in the migratory rhythm of animals whose patterns depend on changing daylight. In the Pacific, among several oceanic groups, duality appears again, but in a form that reflects a very different environment. Here, the division may be between land and sea, or between the prevailing and returning winds that determine not only navigation but survival. Some traditions pair the sun's strength with the moon's governance of tides. Others pair complementary ancestral forces whose responsibilities mirror the shifting balance of wet and dry seasons. While these systems cannot be collapsed into a single universal template, each tradition is specific, local, and shaped by its own history. Analysts have noticed a shared tendency to interpret environmental contrast through paired entities. And although solar observation plays a less central role in some island regions than in continental settings, the annual movement of the sun remains a reliable marker for navigation, planting, and ritual timing. Across all these examples, one fact emerges with steady clarity. The earliest dualities were not invented to explain morality. They were developed to understand time, and time, for early societies, was measured through light. In this sense, duality is the cognitive counterpart to the winter solstice. When the sun reached its lowest point and hesitated before returning, people observed that the year itself contained two great movements, the approach of darkness and the approach of light. This shift was not instantaneous. It unfolded over weeks, even months, and required attentive observation to recognize. The solstice became the fulcrum between these forces, a turning point that taught humans to see the world as a structured interplay rather than a single, unbroken state. We do not know whether the earliest Indo-European speakers, or the earliest East Asian communities, or the earliest African storytellers thought explicitly in terms of cosmic balance, but we do know from anthropological studies that people everywhere link environmental contrast with conceptual contrast. Cognitive linguistics supports this. Humans map abstract categories onto physical experience. Light and dark become metaphors for beginning and ending. Heat and cold become markers of energy and rest. Growth and decay become ways of interpreting human action. These mappings appear early, often before writing, and show up in archaeological evidence in the form of dual aligned structures, seasonal ritual deposits, and repeated patterns in early symbolic art. One example comes from the study of Neolithic settlement organisation in parts of Eurasia. Archaeologists have noticed that some communal structures appear to be oriented not simply toward the rising sun at a specific time of year, but toward the contrasting direction associated with the declining sun. The buildings themselves seem to embody the tension between these two principles. Storage pits, hearth placements, and communal gathering areas reflect different seasonal functions, suggesting that duality had begun to shape not just stories but daily life. Although the evidence remains debated, some researchers interpret this as early cosmological structuring, grounded in environmental necessity. Another example can be found in early Iranian traditions, where the figure associated with dawn appears in opposition to a figure associated with night, both essential to the turning of the year. Comparative mythology studies propose that these pairs reflect older Indo-European patterns, though this remains cautious and contested. What is clear is that these traditions connect seasonal change with mythic roles. Dawn is not merely light, it is the beginning of strength. Night is not merely darkness, it is the keeper of the unseen, the necessary stillness before renewal. What makes this remarkable is the consistency of the underlying logic. In all these cases, duality emerges because the environment itself presents dual cycles: winter and summer, growth and decline, light and dark. For ancient peoples, these contrasts were not abstract categories, they were lived realities. Survival depended on understanding them, and over time, practical knowledge became narrative structure, and narrative structure became cosmology. This helps us understand why so many early traditions contain paired deities, spirits, or forces whose roles mirror the movement of the seasons. The year was never experienced as a single entity. It was experienced as a shifting balance, and humans, fragile in the face of environmental change, positioned themselves within this balance. They were not above it, they were part of it. The winter solstice, with its slow return of light, became the point where the two forces touched, the boundary that separated decline from renewal, the moment when darkness reached its limit and yielded, however, gradually to the returning sun. Duality systems encode this moment. They are the cognitive imprint of solstice observation. And within that duality, people place themselves. If we look more closely at how early communities lived through the extremes of the year, another dimension of duality becomes visible, not in myth, but in the rhythm of subsistence. Archaeobotanical studies from temperate regions show that food availability often follows a sharply divided pattern. Summer offers abundance in the form of ripening grains, berries, and seasonally migrating animals, while winter imposes scarcity, forcing groups to rely on stored resources, dried foods, and strategic hunting. This alternation between plenty and limitation left a deep imprint on cultural expectations. Several hunter-gatherer groups documented in the early 20th century retained seasonal rituals that symbolically opened and closed the year, marking the time when one mode of living yielded to the other. Although these traditions cannot be projected backward without caution, they demonstrate how environmental cycles shape conceptual dualities in predictable ways. Archaeologists studying early coastal populations in northern Japan have noted a similar rhythm, tied not to agriculture, but to marine activity. Fish runs follow seasonal patterns governed by water temperature and daylight shifts. Communities responded by developing paired ritual events that aligned with these cycles. One marked the return of migratory fish and longer days, another acknowledged the retreat of marine resources into darker, colder months. Neither ritual framed the change as conflict. Both recognized that the world oscillated between two conditions that required different behaviors. This ecological pairing may have laid the groundwork for later cosmological dualities observed in early Japanese mythology, though the evidence remains circumstantial. Further south, in the highlands of the central Andes, duality appears embedded in the structure of social organization itself. Ethno-historic records describe moieties, paired social groups with complementary responsibilities, that predate the Inca Empire. Some scholars suggest that these dual groupings mirror environmental contrasts between upper and lower ecological zones, each with its own agricultural calendar. Whether or not these arrangements have prehistoric origins, they reflect the same logic found elsewhere. Humans divide the world into paired categories when the landscape imposes paired conditions. And while later Andean cosmology incorporated solar deities and celestial alignments, the earliest expressions of duality seem linked to land and season rather than doctrine. Even in regions with relatively mild seasonal variation, such as parts of the Mediterranean, early cosmologies reveal an awareness of opposing principles articulated through environmental cues. Paleoclimatic studies show that seasonal winds, such as the Etesian winds of the Aegean, create strong annual contrasts in weather patterns and sea conditions. Some researchers propose that these winds formed part of the conceptual basis for paired deities associated with distinct seasonal phases. Although these links are speculative, they illustrate how environmental dualities can give rise to symbolic ones, even where the solstice plays a subtler role. Across these cases, a common thread emerges: duality as a cognitive response to environmental rhythm. Humans observe contrast, and through repetition, contrast becomes structure. What distinguishes the solstice within this broader framework is its reliability. Winds shift, rainfall fluctuates, animal migrations vary. But the sun's movement along the horizon is steady in a way few other natural phenomena are. This reliability made the solstice the most dependable marker of the turning point between the year's two great halves. And perhaps this is why dualities persist so strongly through time. They encode not only ecological knowledge but existential recognition, the understanding that life is lived between forces that rise and fall, that neither abundance nor scarcity lasts forever, that light returns only after decline. These ideas did not begin as metaphors, they began as observations, and long before they hardened into philosophical systems, they guided how early peoples arranged their calendars, their settlements, their rituals, and their stories. Within this balanced world of paired forces, people found a place for themselves, not as rulers of the cycle, not as victims of it, but as participants who learned to live between its two unfolding halves. A small circle of humans stands at the mouth of a cave, not to enter it for shelter or to hide from wind, but simply to look into its darkness as if it were a horizon in reverse. The winter sun has slipped so low that its light reaches almost nothing inside. In that dimness, where stone swallows colour and breath turns to mist, something older than any carved symbol begins to stir in the human imagination. A thought emerges, quiet and unspoken. If the sun itself weakens each year, perhaps it too returns from some hidden chamber like this. It is an idea rooted not in fantasy, but in the lived rhythm of winter, a season when even the strongest hunters felt their strength pulled thin, and when darkness didn't just surround a community, but settled inside their shelters, their memories, and their bones. What if I told you that long before caves became shrines or holy places, they were understood simply as the deepest form of night that the land could offer? Their blackness mirrored the season itself, and the people who visited them during the coldest weeks of the year stepped into a world that behaved exactly like the sky above, withdrawing light, holding breath, waiting. Archaeologists studying Upper Paleolithic sites have noted that some of the earliest cave art appears deep within twisting chambers, where natural light never reaches. The evidence does not tell us precisely why early humans chose such difficult places for their most attentive work, but the pattern is consistent enough to suggest that darkness was not a barrier, it was part of the meaning. The cave became a place where transformation could be imagined, where something hidden could take shape before returning to the world outside. Picture a moment when a small group of people enters such a chamber, their fire carried on simple torches, casting flickering shadows across walls that had waited tens of thousands of years to be seen. In that trembling, unreliable light, animals leap from stone, lines curve and spiral, and the world feels suspended. Scholars have long debated whether these images were symbolic, ritual, instructive, or simply expressive. But one thread runs through many interpretations. The cave's interior acted as a liminal zone, a place neither fully safe nor fully threatening, similar to the threshold moments of winter when daylight shortened to its limit. In this setting, darkness was not only endured but studied. The very structure of the cave created a world where emergence mattered, where one left the depth and returned to brightness. We do not know for certain why so many early myths describe the sun as being born from caves, mounds, eggs, or other enclosed spaces, but comparative mythography shows remarkable consistency. Across northern Eurasia, the fire at midwinter was said to be kindled in hidden places. In some early Indo-European parallels, light is described as lying enclosed or waiting beneath, language that suggests a conceptual space like a chamber or womb. In parts of the ancient Near East, winter solstice rituals took place at night in subterranean rooms, their architecture designed to hold darkness as carefully as Newgrange held the returning beam of the sun. In these accounts, the annual return of light was imagined not as an effortless sunrise but as a birth, slow, uncertain, vulnerable. Archaeological work in Eurasia, the Americas and the Pacific reveals another layer of this pattern. Ethnographers studying societies with strong seasonal cycles often record midwinter ceremonies held inside enclosed structures, particularly those where the interior space mimicked the shape of a cave. Rounded walls, low ceilings, a single entrance facing east or southeast. These were not burial chambers but communal places of waiting and watching. Long before writing described such spaces as symbolic, people arranged their bodies in them to match the season's shape. They sat in darkness, listened to wind, felt the slow deepening of night, and the return of light became an event experienced together rather than simply observed. In this light, the universality of cave symbolism is less surprising. When we step into prehistoric art caves today, we often forget that early humans did so without modern lamps, without certainty, and without the expectation of beauty. They entered because caves behaved like midwinter, cold, still, and containing an unmeasured pause. The enclosed darkness made it possible to imagine the sun not as a distant sphere, but as something that could be held, nurtured, or sheltered until its strength returned. In many traditions, the cave is described as protective rather than threatening, a gestational space rather than a tomb. Even when used for burials, the mound or chamber was oriented toward the sky in ways that mirrored the larger cycle of renewal. We can trace this symbolism through carvings that show spirals unfurling from darkened interiors, through myths where heroes or deities rest beneath mountains before emerging renewed, and through linguistic metaphors where light is described as breaking out, coming forth, or rising from hidden places. None of this proves a single origin, but the parallels show that enclosed darkness was one of the earliest canvases upon which humans projected the rhythm of the year. The darkness inside the cave acted both as a physical experience and as a cognitive template, a space where one could imagine the world restarting. The cave, then, became the natural stage for the newborn sun. Its darkness matched the season's fragility. Its narrow entrance framed the first signs of returning brightness, and its depth held silence long enough for stories to form. From the archaeological record to the surviving mythic fragments, we see that the earlier solstice narratives did not need grand temples or complex calendars. They needed only the human body, the turning of the year, and a place where light and darkness could meet. And with this setting established, societies expanded the cast. Yet there is another dimension to this relationship between darkness and meaning that archaeologists have only recently begun to articulate. Caves do not simply remove light, they distort sound. In chambers across Europe, researchers have documented unusual acoustic properties. echoes that stretch longer than expected, frequencies amplified at certain points, and pockets of silence so complete that one's own heartbeat becomes the loudest presence in the room. These properties were not designed by the people who entered them, but they would have been unmistakable. A group gathered inside such an environment would feel the shift from the open world into a place that answered back differently. Even without language to describe it, the change in sound could suggest that a space was alive. This acoustic strangeness strengthened the impression that what emerged from such a place would be transformed. It is not possible to determine the intention behind every artifact found in deep cave contexts, but the placement of certain objects indicates careful staging. In several sites, small deposits of ochre, bone fragments, or pierced shells appear in niches far removed from practical light sources. These items were not left casually. They were positioned with the same kind of attention that later societies used in ritual enclosures. Their darkness does not diminish their significance. On the contrary, it suggests that the act of leaving them there was more important than the ability to see them afterward. This sense of offering into darkness directly parallels the later mythic theme of giving something to the womb of winter so that light might return renewed. Across ethnographic records, caves also appear repeatedly as places where humans went to learn something about their own endurance. In several circumpolar traditions, initiates were taken into dark interiors not to frighten them, but to allow them to sit with silence long enough to confront their own dependency on the returning sun. These practices, though separated by vast distances and differing ecologies, share a structural resemblance to the imagined journey of light itself: descent, stillness, and emergence. Whether or not early communities explicitly linked these acts to the solar cycle, their timing and symbolic echoes point toward a shared understanding that darkness was not only a backdrop but a teacher. In many mountain regions, caves were also understood as thresholds connecting visible and invisible realms. Archaeological surveys in the Zagros, the Pyrenees, and parts of the Altai reveal repeated occupation of cave mouths rather than deep interiors. These threshold spaces received just enough light to allow activity while still maintaining a strong contrast between the bright outside world and the shadowed interior. Here, people may have enacted seasonal transitions physically, stepping between zones that represented the shifting balance between darkness and brightness. The cave mouth became a living metaphor for the solstice itself, a moment when the world stood on the edge of two states. This helps explain why so many later myths describe the newborn sun emerging from an enclosed place not with triumphant clarity, but with gentle uncertainty, as if feeling its way back into existence. The archaeological and mythological threads converge on a single impression: that early humans understood darkness not as an empty void, but as a necessary stage in renewal. The sun's return each winter was powerful precisely because it came from a space where nothing could be seen, only imagined. And in that imagined emergence, the earlier stories found their shape. Bronze Age iconography provides some of the clearest material evidence for this emerging idea. Across parts of Europe and Southwest Asia, solar imagery begins to appear alongside figures who grasp, lead, or accompany solar symbols. These images are rarely explicit about narrative function, but the recurring association of human-like or divine figures with solar discs suggests an early conceptualization of guardianship. Rather than depicting the sun alone, many carvings and bronze plaques depict it supported, carried, or guided. The placement of these images in ceremonial contexts implies they were understood within a framework of responsibility and stewardship. This is consistent with broader archaeological patterns showing that the shift to more complex societies brought heightened awareness of continuity and preservation. When communities invested in long-term food storage, organised labour, and planned seasonal cycles, they also conceived of cosmic order as something requiring maintenance. The pastoral metaphors underpinning many of these myths reveal how deeply everyday survival shaped early cosmology. Before ritual calendars took shape, before monumental architecture fixed the solstice in stone, the safeguarding of life was already a central concern. Grain stores had to be protected from rot and pests. Herds had to be kept warm. Fires needed tending through the night. In stories, these realities transformed into guardians of the sun, figures who held vigil while the light was at its weakest. Even in agricultural societies, where crops were planted in spring rather than tended through winter, the idea of nurturing resurfaces in mythic motifs. The sowing of seeds into dark soil carried natural thematic parallels to the return of light after solstice. In several Near Eastern traditions, the birth or renewal of divine beings coincided with these agricultural cycles, embedding guardianship into both cosmic and earthly seasons. Comparative mythology helps illuminate the breadth of this pattern. In Vedic traditions, Usha's, the dawn goddess, is often accompanied by ancillary figures who prepare or navigate her passage. In certain Iranian sources, protective beings prevent the encroachment of darkness or disorder, guiding the return of light. Early Celtic myth cycles include maternal or guardian deities, whose seasonal roles align closely with winter solstice themes. Each tradition has its own history, its own cultural and environmental context, yet they all converge on the symbolic idea that new light does not arise unaided. It must be carried, watched over, or guided through darkness. These parallels do not prove a single origin for the archetype, but they demonstrate a shared sensitivity to the fragility of the seasonal cycle. Archaeological caution is important here. We cannot claim that every protective figure in early mythology directly corresponds to agricultural labour or pastoral practice. What we can say, based on available evidence, is that the conceptual link between vulnerability and care permeates early stories of the sun. It appears consistently across societies with very different economic systems. The universality of winter hardship may have been the common thread. When nights grew longer and cold encroached on the smaller settlements, people were reminded that survival required watchfulness. Stories took shape around that need, not as entertainment, but as a form of cognitive mapping, a way to articulate what must be protected if the world is to continue. In this sense, the guardians of early myths are not heroic in the later classical sense. They are closer to stewards, companions, or caretakers, figures whose importance lies in their constancy rather than their power. They represent the quiet work that sustains life when conditions are harshest. And as societies grew more complex, the symbolic responsibilities of these guardians expanded. They became organisers of cosmic order, keepers of boundaries, or mediators between worlds. Yet their earliest role was simple: to protect what was fragile. Seen in this light, the emergence of solar guardians is not mysterious or mythic in origin. It reflects a deeply human response to the rhythms of the year. Protecting the sun in story echoed protecting resources in reality. And so, as the cultural and environmental world of early humans grew more layered, so too did the characters that inhabited their sky narratives. Somewhere in the long winter before agriculture, a small community sits in the blue-dark quiet of a late solstice dawn, watching the sky not just for light but for reassurance. The sun is returning, yes, but weakly, almost tentatively, as if unsure it wants to rise at all. In that fragile appearance, people saw something that felt familiar. They knew what it was to coax life from cold ground, to protect the last stores of dried meat, to tend embers overnight so that fire did not die. Picture a moment when the faint light on the horizon seemed almost like a life being carried, guarded, or nursed, and you begin to understand why so many of the oldest sun myths do not begin with a triumphant god, but with a watcher, a guardian, or a mother. The earlier stories did not assume the sun could defend itself. They assumed instead that something had to keep it safe. If the previous segment traced how enclosed darkness became the cradle for imagining the sun's rebirth, then this one marks the next quiet shift, a recognition that even light needs care. It is not possible to isolate a single point in time when protective figures emerge, but the patterns across early mythic systems suggest that their appearance coincides with a growing awareness of dependency, and by dependency, we mean not the symbolic kind invoked by later religions, but the practical, everyday reality of life in the earliest agricultural and pastoral communities. The archaeological and linguistic record hints that as people began to guard fields, flocks, stored grain, and winter supplies, they simultaneously began to imagine cosmic forces as needing guardianship too. It is not that myth copied daily life, nor that daily life copied myth, but rather that both were shadows cast by the same underlying concern. Nothing precious survives winter unprotected. Archaeology gives us one line of evidence. In parts of the Near East, small figurines dating to the early agricultural period show protective postures that some scholars cautiously interpret as associated with fertility, nurturing, or safeguarding. These figurines do not explicitly depict solar beings, but their symbolic role fits within a broader cultural tendency to associate care with survival. In pre-writing societies, metaphors often travelled silently from one realm of experience to another. If a community already relied on the careful tending of young animals or seedlings to survive the cold season, it is not surprising that their narratives would imagine the sun itself as something requiring similar attention. Early pastoralists, in particular, developed a vocabulary of safeguarding that appears to carry over into mythic portrayals of cosmic guardians. Linguistic studies offer another thread. In the reconstructed lexicon of Proto-Indo-European languages, a cluster of terms describing protection, covering, or watching over appears in close proximity to words associated with dawn, brightness, and newness. This does not prove a mythological connection, but it suggests that speakers of these ancient languages linked concepts of vulnerability and emergence. The dawn light, faint and fleeting in winter months, may have inspired metaphors of guardianship that later solidified into named figures. In some Indo-Iranian traditions, the dawn is accompanied or preceded by beings whose role is to defend, nurture or guide newly returning light. These figures are not warriors in the later martial sense. They are caretakers, intermediaries, or watchers of thresholds. What they are guarding is not victory, but possibility. Ethnographic parallels from early pastoral societies reinforce this idea. Among groups that lived by herding rather than farming, the winter months were often spent safeguarding young animals from harsh weather. In these contexts, stories frequently reflect a universe where cosmic beings mirror the responsibilities of human life. Light may be imagined as a calf, a lamb, or a newborn creature kept safe from the dangers of the world. The act of tending becomes mythologized as a cosmic truth. This belongs to a wider pattern seen across multiple continents, where the vulnerability of the natural world in winter is interpreted not as a threat but as a relationship. Someone must keep watch. Someone must protect the returning warmth until it can stand on its own. Imagine a moment when the sky stopped being only a source of warmth, danger and light, and became something else entirely, a surface that could be read. The people who lived through the long winters of the late prehistoric world left no carved lexicon to explain when this shift happened. No tablets or scrolls describing the first time someone recognized that the returning sun behaved with the precision of a structured tale. But we can infer, cautiously, that there was an era when humanity moved from simply watching the sky to interpreting it, approaching the heavens not merely as an expanse, but as a sequence. What if I told you that this moment marks one of the earliest steps toward narrative consciousness itself, rooted not in metaphor or invention, but in the dependable logic of daylight's rise and fall? The evidence suggests that by the time settled communities had begun to observe seasonal cycles with greater attention, they were already turning the path of the sun into a kind of temporal grammar. The revelation is simple, but profound. The birth, death, rebirth movement of the sun across the solstice equinox arc became a template that organized how stories were told, when festivals were held, and how obligations were understood. The sky became the first reliable calendar because it moved regardless of human intention, and in its movement, early societies found a structure far older than writing. Its consistency allowed communities to anchor communal memory in something larger than themselves. The traces of this shift can still be seen in the earliest calendrical myth cycles found across Indo-European and Mesoamerican traditions, although these traditions developed independently, separated by oceans and vast periods of time. We do not know for certain how early these cycles emerged, but their broad patterns suggest that communities in both hemispheres recognize the solstices and equinoxes not merely as astronomical events, but as narrative markers, turning points in a cosmic sequence. In Indo-European calendars reconstructed from linguistic evidence, the year often unfolds in paired halves, moving from a moment of perilous darkness in midwinter toward the strengthening of light and the renewal of the world. In Mesoamerica, meanwhile, the sky's divisions became so precise that myth and mathematics intertwined, and the movement of celestial bodies informed not only agricultural decisions, but cosmological meaning. These parallels do not imply a shared origin. They imply a shared human need to locate oneself within a larger rhythm. Both regions developed narrative arcs that correspond to the same four seasonal anchors: midwinter, midsummer, and the equinox transitions where day and night hold equal sway. When archaeologists map early festivals to these points, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. Even societies with limited contact or entirely different ecological pressures appear to mark these moments with stories that echo the dynamics of the sky. It is not that people imagined narrative first and applied it upward. It is that the heavens presented a ready-made sequence long before humans articulated narrative structure. As these seasonal anchors became more widely recognized, they began to shape ritual timing. We see this in the archaeological record of festival layers, where repeated deposits, burnt offerings, food remnants, pigment traces accumulate around the same periods of the year. Such patterns demonstrate that these events were not random. They were organized around celestial time. What emerged was a relationship in which the sky provided the framework and human practice filled in the detail. Communities came to rely on celestial recurrence as a reminder of obligations: when to sow or harvest, when to gather, when to mourn or celebrate. Over time, these obligations became encoded in story fragments, passed orally from one generation to the next. These fragments did not yet form myths as we know them. They were more like narrative cues, pieces of the world's rhythm tied to particular times of year. This is perhaps one of the quietest but most important transitions in human cultural development. Oral fragments began to cohere into sequences, and those sequences formed myths with beginnings, middles, and endings. We can see this shift in later Indo-European traditions, where mythic cycles follow a predictable arc tied to seasonal change, descent into darkness, a crisis or confrontation, and renewal as the world brightens. In the Mesoamerican context, the movement of celestial bodies became so integral that mythic figures and astronomical cycles appear almost inseparable. The sun's journey was not symbolic of the story, it was the story. And because these sequences occurred every year, they became a stable scaffold for meaning. Archaeologists working with settlement-based timekeeping structures note that these narrative patterns appear even in communities without writing. It is as if the sky provided an external memory system, preserving structure when human memory alone might falter. The solstice, the equinox, and the motions of sunrise and sunset created a framework sturdy enough to support stories long before scripts emerged. The sky became the first library, not because it held words, but because its cycles were reliable enough to hold time. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of early narrative cosmology: shared motifs across distant cultures that reflect solar logic, not shared origin. The recurrence of certain themes, descent, liminality, return, renewal, suggests that early humans across the world read similar patterns in the heavens and translated them into stories that followed the same structural rules. The idea of a cyclical renewal of light appears in traditions as far apart as Northern Europe, the Indian subcontinent, Central America, and the Andes. Yet these parallels need not imply diffusion. When separate communities observe the same celestial phenomena, they may arrive at similar narrative conclusions. This is not cultural copying, it is the sky acting as a guide. We also find evidence that the transition from oral fragments to structured myth occurred unevenly. Some societies retained brief seasonal narratives, while others elaborated them into long cycles involving multiple characters, deities, or spirits whose roles reflected environmental shifts. In these expanded traditions, the solstice becomes the beginning of a narrative arc, an emergence, a renewal, a starting point for stories of struggle or growth. The equinox becomes a moment of balance, often associated with key transitions in myth, while midsummer sometimes marks the peak or triumph of a figure associated with light or strength. These correlations are not universal, but they are explanatory. They offer insight into how the sky's steady rhythm could generate a framework for organising time in narrative form. What is most striking is that this happened long before writing codified any of it. When writing finally appeared several thousand years into the Bronze Age, it preserved narratives that had already been shaped for countless generations. By then, the sky had been humanity's script for so long that many written myths simply reflected patterns that had existed orally for millennia. Writing captured these stories, but it did not create them. The scaffold had been built far earlier, in the patient watching of solstice light and the annual movement of shadows. When we say that the sky became a narrative scaffold, we are not speaking metaphorically. We are describing a cognitive transition in which celestial cycles provided the first stable and predictable sequence against which story structure could be formed. This does not mean early humans understood their stories as astronomy. Rather, astronomy and story emerge from the same impulse, to make sense of the world's movements, to find pattern in change, and to locate oneself within a cycle that repeats but never stands still. And in this quiet turning of the heavens, myth found its first structure, and from this scaffold came characters who embodied the sun's power. Imagine watching a flame that barely survives its own birth. Picture a moment when that flame, no larger than a trembling spark in the cold midwinter air, begins to steady itself. This is the image early communities carried with them as they observed the sun's slow return after the deepest point of the year. For societies that lived without artificial light, the growth of daylight was not simply a background change in the environment. It was a transformation that shaped rhythm, survival, and belief. What if I told you that the earlier stories of youthful figures gaining strength may have emerged from this quiet, steady observation, from noticing that the returning sun behaved almost like something young, something learning how to stand? The revelation becomes clearer when we look closely at the way daylight behaves after the solstice. It increases gradually, almost imperceptibly, forcing early observers to develop a patient awareness of change. In the days following midwinter, the sun rises only slightly earlier and sets only slightly later. Its warmth is weak, its arc slow, but the pattern is consistent. From the darkest moment onward, the light does not fail. In archaeological and mythological analysis, this period, when the sun seems to be regaining its footing, often aligns with narratives in which a youthful figure, sometimes described as skyborn or lightborn, begins to gather strength. These stories are not records of astronomy, they are reflections of an ecological truth, the slow, predictable strengthening of the sun after midwinter. By tracing the earliest Indo-European seasonal metaphors, scholars find repeated references to strength that grows rather than erupts. Some linguistic archaeologists have reconstructed terms that compare early sunlight to an awakening force, a being that gradually shakes off dormancy. These metaphors do not emerge from agricultural societies alone. They appear earlier, among groups for whom winter scarcity defined the limits of survival. The return of light was not abstract. It altered hunting opportunities, travel possibilities, and the reliability of food stores. When a story described a youthful figure gaining vigour, the underlying logic was environmental. The world itself was brightening. In many parts of Eurasia, the earliest agricultural planning was tied to these lengthening days, even before the development of formal calendars. Archaeobotanical evidence shows that communities tracked increasing daylight to anticipate soil readiness, animal movement, and thaw cycles. In this context, a growing or strengthening figure becomes more than poetic symbolism. It becomes a mnemonic tool, a way to remember that the period following midwinter marks the beginning of preparation. Each incremental increase in daylight signaled that it was time to check stored grains, maintain tools, or assess herd conditions. Myth became a cognitive framework for environmental timing, and the young solar figure became a memory of what the sun itself was doing. Across distant cultures, we find hero narratives that follow an arc strikingly similar to the sun's ascent. The figure begins weak, faces early challenges, and gains strength through trials, only reaching full potential when light dominates the year. This pattern appears in traditions that are geographically and linguistically unrelated, yet they share an underlying logic: growth through the return of light. Modern scholars caution against assuming cultural connection where none exists. These parallels emerge from ecological observation, not mutual influence. When communities experience the same seasonal transitions, they may generate similar narrative structures. The strengthening sun becomes a teacher of forms. What makes these growth arcs particularly compelling is how they intersect with early rites of passage. Archaeological research on initiation rituals shows that many took place in late winter or early spring, precisely when daylight was becoming more dependable. The evidence suggests that communities use seasonal change as a framework for personal transformation. A youth who underwent initiation during this period did so when the world itself was transitioning from weakness to strength. The maturing figure in myth mirrored the maturing figure in society. These rites were not only about becoming an adult, they were about aligning oneself with the same rhythms that governed crops, herds, and migratory patterns. Ethnographic parallels reinforce this point. In several pastoral and hunter-gatherer groups, the timing of rites aligns closely with seasonal milestones. The period after midwinter is often marked by renewed activity, return to hunting routes, strengthening of animals, and preparation for longer journeys. The timing suggests that these rites functioned as both social ceremonies and ecological adaptations. Aligning personal transformation with the growing light was a way of synchronizing the human body to the land. In early mythic cycles, youthful figures often face symbolic challenges that reflect environmental reality. In some traditions, the young light must push back against forces associated with cold, scarcity, or inertia. In others, its growth is framed as a slow accumulation of power, almost like embers gathering heat. The metaphors differ, but the pattern remains. Returning light is not triumphant at first. It must build itself day after day. The stories reflect this incremental rhythm. This observation helps explain one of the most significant features of early myth. The hero does not simply appear fully formed. They begin uncertain, vulnerable, and untested. The community recognizes itself in this vulnerability. Winter strips away excess and leaves only what can endure. When the light returns, it returns thinly. The youthful figure grows because the sun grows. Strength is not instantaneous. It is earned through the passage of time. As communities became more complex, these narratives grew more elaborate. Some added companions who aided the young light. Others introduced challenges that symbolized the obstacles of early spring. Unpredictable weather, lingering cold, or scarcity that had not yet eased. The arc of the maturing hero thus became an interpretive framework for the transition between deep winter and the more forgiving months. Even as societies expanded into agricultural production, the patterned growth of daylight remained central to how time was understood. It is important to state clearly that these stories do not imply knowledge of astronomy in the scientific sense. They reflect an intuitive engagement with the world. Early communities interpreted what they could observe, and what they observed was that light, once it began to return, did not stop. The hero's growth was a lesson in patience and expectation. The predictability of daylight offered reassurance that the challenges of winter would pass. The maturing figure became a memory of this reassurance. Archaeological findings support the idea that solstice-linked rites of passage were embedded in early social life. Excavations in several regions reveal that seasonal gatherings often included activities tied to marking personal milestones or reinforcing communal identity. The return of light provided the ceremonial backdrop, offering a symbolic narrative of growth during a time when the community needed to reaffirm connections. These gatherings may not have included explicit references to light children or skyborn heroes, but the timing alone indicates that seasonal change shaped human meaning. What is most striking about these narratives is how they preserve an emotional truth, that strength often arrives slowly, emerging from the most vulnerable moment. The young solar figure does not rush. It grows with the same rhythm the world provides, and early societies living close to the land and dependent on its cycles understood this intimately. Growth was not a burst of power, it was a steady ascent. The realization that emerges from this evidence is simple. The maturation of early mythical figures mirrors the sun's return, not because communities imposed narrative onto the sky, but because the sky offered a rhythm that could be lived, felt, and trusted. The hero grows because the world grows lighter. The child of winter becomes the youth of early spring. And in that transformation, ancient people recognized both the environment around them and the changes within themselves, there is also a quieter dimension to this seasonal maturation that rarely appears in later theological traditions, but is visible in the earliest layers of oral memory, the way communities interpreted the quality of returning light, not just its duration. In the weeks after the solstice, the early sun does not simply grow stronger, it changes colour and texture as it climbs slightly higher in the sky. Ethno-astronomers studying traditional societies have noted that observational languages often carry distinct terms for the soft winter gleam, the sharp clarity of early spring, and the warmer radiance that arrives near planting time. These distinctions matter because they are rooted in lived experience. The strengthening hero or skyborn youth is not only about increasing hours of light, but about a shifting sensory world in which visibility, shadow length, and warmth gradually realign. When myths speak of a young figure gaining clarity or emerging from dimness, they may reflect these subtle atmospheric changes. This is supported by archaeological work examining dwellings aligned to early light angles. At several sites across northern Eurasia, traces of habitation show that structures were positioned to capture the returning rays of late winter mornings, not simply for warmth, but for visibility during tasks requiring precision. The angle of early light mattered. It shaped how tools were repaired, how fibres were prepared, and how food stores were evaluated. When the youthful light in story is described as learning, sharpening, or revealing what winter obscured, the metaphor parallels the way these communities experienced their own environment. We also see evidence of seasonal bodily change embedded in the earliest metaphors of growth. Paleophysiological studies of high-latitude populations suggest that energy expenditure, sleep cycles, and hormone levels vary dramatically between midwinter and early spring. The shift from torpor-like conservation toward renewed activity is mirrored in narrative arcs, describing figures who awaken slowly, test their limbs, or re-enter the world after a period of stillness. Rather than supernatural invention, these portrayals echo the lived human body responding to changing daylight. The hero grows because the people telling the story feel themselves growing too. There's another layer revealed through comparative seasonal ritual, the role of community in supporting the growth of both light and youth. Several early societies mark the weeks after the solstice with communal tasks that required cooperation, clearing snowpaths, securing water sources, repairing shelters, or tending weakened livestock. These tasks reinforced social bonds precisely when the sun was gaining strength. In myths that describe companions assisting the youthful figure, or communities protecting the early light, the symbolic echo becomes clear. Growth was never solitary. It depended on collective effort, just as survival through late winter depended on mutual support. By tracing these ecological, physiological, and social patterns, we begin to see why the growing fire became one of the most universally resonant images in the early mythic imagination. It was not simply an aesthetic metaphor. It was an entire transformation visible in the land, the sky, the body, and the community. The maturing light became a template for how strength itself was understood, as something built gradually, carried carefully, and recognized only when the world had changed enough to reveal it. And it is within this deep relationship between light and experience that myths began to shift from observation to confrontation. A community standing at the edge of the coldest season, listening to the wind move through bare branches and knowing that every night could bring something unpredictable. Picture a moment when winter was not an inconvenience but a living threat, when darkness itself felt like an active presence pressing against the campfire's fragile circle of warmth. What if I told you that this pressure, this quiet fear of the season's longest night, is where many cultures first found the figure they would later call an enemy, not because they believed in eternal evil, but because they had to name the dangers that winter carried. We do not know how the very first of these stories sounded when spoken beside early hearths, yet the pattern is familiar across regions that never met. The winter solstice sits at the hinge of the year, a time when the sun reaches its lowest strength. It is precisely here that myths begin to imagine an opposing force, not abstract or philosophical, but shaped by cold realities. In the oldest layers of solstice-linked traditions, the enemy is often a creature of night, a serpent emerging from the frozen earth, a devourer of light, a figure representing hunger, misfortune, or the unseen dangers that accompany deep winter. Archaeology cannot record fear, but it can record the environmental pressures that would have made fear rational. Across northern latitudes, winter predators behaved differently than they did in warm seasons. Wolves tracked human settlements more closely when prey was scarce. Bears moved unpredictably when food ran out. Even large cats in some regions followed migration patterns that brought them nearer to humans during the darkest months. The fossil and ecological records show that winter changed predator behaviour, and later stories mirrored these patterns. When a tale speaks of a serpent that stirs only during the long nights, or a force that must be driven back for light to return, the ecological backdrop is not difficult to imagine. We do not have to assume that people believed darkness itself was a conscious entity. More likely, they expressed danger in the form most intuitive to oral societies, as a living opponent. This is why so many solstice narratives describe an adversary that threatens the new or returning light. Among the earliest Indo-European traditions, scholars have identified structural oppositions between sky figures who bring warmth and shadow figures who obstruct or delay it. Similar dualities appear in early Near Eastern stories, where serpents, chaotic waters, or winter spirits must be subdued for the ordered cycle of seasons to resume. Importantly, these adversaries do not necessarily represent evil. They represent instability, the thin margin of survival that winter imposed. Ethnographic parallels strengthen this view. Circumpolar storytelling traditions often describe beings who interfere with the sun's path or who hold it back. Yet when these tales are recorded closely, their emphasis is not moral. Instead, they reflect specific seasonal hazards, storms that block the horizon, cold snaps that threaten stored food, or sudden darkness that interrupts travel and hunting. In these oral accounts, antagonistic figures simply personify the unpredictability of winter. They give shape to something formless. In some traditions across Siberia, northern Europe, and parts of the North American Arctic, there are stories in which the sun disappears because something obscures it or steals it. Scholars examining these tales note that they likely emerge from the real difficulty of tracking daylight changes at high latitudes, where the sun's path shifts rapidly near the solstice and storms can erase the sky for days. A myth describing the sun being swallowed or carried away may reflect a time when its faint midwinter light was easily lost to cloud cover. Linguistic evidence supports this practical interpretation. Many early words associated with darkness in Indo-European languages carry connotations tied not to moral danger, but to concealment, covering, or obscuration. The enemy in these contexts is something that hides or blocks, rather than something metaphysically opposed to good. When we look across ancient farming and herding societies, seasonal threats become even more visible. Winter famine was not metaphorical. If a community had miscalculated its stores, or if the harvest had been poor, the darkest months meant genuine vulnerability. It is in this context that we find stories of devouring forces, stories where darkness consumes or weakens the returning sun. These narrative forms likely helped communities articulate collective anxiety. They offered an explanation that fit the rhythm of the year. Darkness rose because the sun was weak. It fell because the sun regained strength. The pattern remains remarkably consistent across independent regions. In early Iranian traditions, antagonistic winter figures slow the return of warmth. In northern European cycles, shadow beings disrupt the rising light. In some Near Eastern stories, serpents or chthonic forces obstruct the ordered sky. These are not identical myths, yet their functions align. They describe the same seasonal challenge in different languages. What stands out most is not the imagery, but the timing. These stories cluster around midwinter, the point of deepest uncertainty. Before the agricultural surplus, before long-distance trade, before central authorities stored emergency grain, winter required explanation. To say that darkness had an enemy gave shape to a problem. To say that the sun was threatened provided a narrative structure strong enough to carry memory across generations. And so, the winter adversary became a central figure in myth. Yet we must be careful not to overstate the case. Archaeological evidence can tell us that winter was dangerous. Textual and linguistic evidence can show recurring oppositional structures. Ethnographic parallels can demonstrate that communities facing similar ecological pressures invented similar explanations. But none of this proves that one specific serpent or demon existed as a universal idea. Rather, the evidence suggests that seasonal conditions produced a shared need to explain risk. Humans everywhere use story to map uncertainty. In this sense, the enemy made of night emerged not from metaphysics but from climate. The long dark of midwinter required a narrative counterpart, something that could be resisted, outlasted, or symbolically defeated as the days grew longer. When the sun began its ascent, the adversary faded, not because it had been conquered in a cosmic battle, but because the environmental threat had eased. And in that easing, a story found its natural end. The danger was temporary. The return of light was the resolution. The enemy was winter itself, told in the language of metaphor. This danger shaped how the story of light's return ended. What becomes clearer when we move deeper into the archaeological record is that these antagonistic figures were not created all at once. They evolved slowly, shaped by practical concerns long before they were shaped by theology. Seasonal unpredictability was itself a kind of teacher. When storms arrived earlier than expected, or when cold lingered past the time when early crops should have emerged, communities needed a conceptual tool to explain disruption. Many early myths describe adversaries who delay, interfere, or interrupt rather than destroy. This is an important difference. The language of the early narratives often revolves around blockage rather than annihilation. A serpent coils around the sun not to end its light forever, but to hinder its path. A winter being obscures the young light rather than extinguishing it. This emphasis on obstruction mirrors the lived difficulty of maintaining stability during winter, where even minor disruptions could have profound consequences. Archaeologists studying early settlement layers in high-latitude regions have observed that winter variability is written into the architecture itself. Storage pits grow deeper, hearths become more central, entrances narrow as if to guard against rising winds. These structural adjustments suggest heightened attention to the winter's demands. It is not hard to imagine how such vigilance encouraged stories in which darkness actively pressed against the boundaries of the human world. When communities reinforced their dwellings against the season, stories reinforced their cosmologies in parallel. A narrative adversary could give shape to the tension between the stability of the settlement and the instability outside it. Even in regions closer to the equator, where winter was milder, stories of obstructing figures appear in contexts shaped not by cold, but by irregular rains, sudden cloud cover, or the unpredictability of seasonal monsoons. In these places, the enemy is often connected with cloud serpents, shadowcasters, or figures who hide the sun behind layers of mist. Though the environmental conditions differ, the underlying conceptual pattern remains similar. A disruption in expected light becomes the work of a disruptive being. When light returns, the culprit loses influence. These narrative structures appear to arise wherever people depend on predictable seasonal behaviour for survival. One of the most revealing insights comes from linguistic studies that trace ancient root words for shadow, cover, and darkening. In several language families, these words are not inherently negative. Instead, they describe natural processes that temporarily obscure visibility. This reinforces the idea that the mythic enemy of the sun began as a functional description rather than a moral category. Over time, as narratives accumulated layers of symbolism, these once neutral figures took on characteristics shaped by cultural values, ritual practices, or emerging social hierarchies. But their origins remain grounded in the physical environment. By the time more elaborate cosmologies appeared, the winter adversary was no longer just a seasonal metaphor but a recurring character with established narrative roles. Yet embedded in every version of the tale is the same quiet understanding. Danger does not last. The return of the sun dissolves the adversary's power. Light is restored not through triumph, but through patience and the slow turning of the year. This danger shaped how the story of light's return ended. Imagine a moment when the first thin blade of light rises after the longest night, not as a spectacle, not as a revelation, but as a small confirmation that the world has not ended. For most of human history, winter pressed hard against the lives of those who lived close to the limits of subsistence. Food stores diminished, illness lingered, travel became dangerous, and in those long weeks the sun's faint path across the horizon seemed to shrink until even its appearance could feel uncertain. So when the light finally lengthened, even by the smallest margin, early communities responded with something far more instinctive than celebration. They exhaled. They stood in the cold and watched the faint promise of survival, and in that watching they shaped one of the oldest and simplest ideas in myth, that what returns renews the world. The evidence suggests that at midwinter, across many parts of Eurasia and beyond, people performed small rituals of relighting. Archaeological traces from later prehistoric layers show the repeated presence of hearths that appear freshly cleaned or rekindled at consistent points in the seasonal cycle. In some regions of northern Europe, ash deposits indicate deliberate extinguishing and reigniting of communal fire, a symbolic gesture that scholars interpret as marking the turning of the year. Farther south, charred remains in ritual pits coincide with the winter season, suggesting that the act of creating flame anew was aligned with the sun's slow strengthening. These practices were not yet codified religion. They were simple, almost domestic acts performed in the cold, likely accompanied by the kind of quiet attention that arises when people feel time changing around them. Oral traditions preserve echoes of these small ceremonies. Ethnographic records from circumpolar communities describe gatherings held not at the solstice moment itself, but just after, when daylight began to noticeably advance. In several traditions, the phrase, "the day is coming back," appears as a shorthand for safety's return. Other groups use metaphors of waking, rising, or stirring, as if the land itself was regaining awareness. These patterns appear not because the groups were connected, but because they all watched the same slow shift in the sky. When the light grew, even slightly, it signalled that the worst had passed. Mythic language reflects this sense of relief. The world was imagined as opening, warming, or breathing again. Danger slackened its hold. The year reset. Agricultural communities gave this renewal a different meaning. In early farming societies of the Near East and southeastern Europe, the lengthening days corresponded to the first signs of the coming planting season. Even though sowing itself came weeks or months later, the sun's return marked the beginning of the agricultural year's psychological cycle. Linguistic studies show that many Indo-European languages contain ancient metaphors linking sunrise with victory and success. The root associated with to overcome in several branches is closely tied to dawn or sunrise imagery, suggesting that the triumph of daylight over darkness became a template for describing positive outcomes. This may reflect the agricultural mindset. The returning sun did not only banish winter, it enabled the future harvest. In this way, renewal was not just emotional reassurance, but practical anticipation. Communal gatherings formed another layer of renewal. Archaeological findings from midwinter feasting sites in northern Europe show concentrated deposits of animal remains, pottery and hearth waste occurring at consistent points in the seasonal cycle. These gatherings were not solely social events. They served as markers that the community remained intact. Winter could scatter people across different shelters or hunting zones, but the increasing daylight provided a natural moment for reassembly. Stories likely circulated at these gatherings about the last hard weeks, the dangers endured, and the plans for the year ahead. In the retelling of these seasonal hardships, mythic motifs of victory over darkness became social glue, connecting personal experience to the wider rhythm of the world. Light returning at midwinter also shaped metaphors of continuity. In many oral traditions, the sun's reappearance was described as the world waking again, a phrase that combines cosmic scale with human familiarity. Linguistic parallels across cultures link the idea of renewal with the sunrise itself. In early Indo-Iranian languages, metaphors of rejuvenation are tied to words for light. In several northern Eurasian traditions, the phrase for New Year is etymologically linked to the return of brightness or the lifting of the sky. These parallels do not imply shared origin, but shared observation. People looked at the same horizon, saw the same slow change, and imagined renewal through the same sensory experience. We do not know the precise emotional tone of these early ceremonies, but ethnographic comparisons suggest that they carried a mix of relief and modest optimism. The winter solstice did not immediately change conditions. Food was still scarce, temperatures still dangerous. But the return of sunlight provided a psychological pivot. It was the one dependable turning point the year offered. For groups living far from equatorial regions, where day length varies significantly, the solstice was one of the rare moments when nature offered an unmistakable sign. And in a world where survival could depend on reading subtle environmental cues, that sign took on profound meaning. The role of renewal myths extended beyond simple reassurance. They also structured time. In many agricultural and pastoral societies, the year was divided into seasons not only by climatic patterns, but by narrative sequences. The return of light marked the beginning of these sequences. The stories told after midwinter formed the foundation for the year's ritual cycle. Later, mythologies would elaborate these patterns into more complex narratives involving deities of spring, vegetation, sacrifice, or rebirth. But at their root lay the same observation. The sun grows again, therefore life grows again. The emotional logic of renewal is built from this basic recognition. Archaeological evidence from ritual structures reinforces the importance of this seasonal threshold. In some parts of prehistoric Britain and Ireland, light interaction features within monuments are oriented toward midwinter sunrise or sunset, not midsummer. This suggests that communities placed greater symbolic weight on the sun's return than on its peak. Midwinter monuments like Newgrange, oriented with extraordinary precision to the solstice sunrise, reveal a consistent focus on renewal rather than abundance. The first light entering the passage each year likely served as a ceremonial moment, a physical enactment of the sun's reawakening. Whether or not people perceived this in narrative terms, the architectural alignment itself shows that renewal was understood as a critical hinge in the year. Beyond Europe, similar patterns appear. In the high Andes, certain agricultural communities performed renewal rituals timed to match the solstice, turning, cleaning irrigation channels, and preparing fields not because planting had begun, but because the sky had signalled that its cycle had restarted. In East Asia, early records from the Zhou period describe rituals of renewal tied to the winter solstice, marking administrative and social reforms to align society with cosmic order. Though later and more structured than the prehistoric contexts we focus on, these examples show the same principle. Renewal tied to the returning sun served as a universal organising force. What becomes clearer, the more we study these early cycles, is that renewal was not imagined as a sudden event, but as a gradual reorientation of life. Archaeologists examining long-term settlement layers in northern Europe note recurring patterns in winter debris, items temporarily set aside, hearth tools placed in consistent positions, storage pits opened and resealed. These gestures likely belong to the same quiet rhythm of readiness that the lengthening daylight inspired. As the sun returned, people adjusted their domestic spaces, not because conditions had already changed, but because they sensed the shift that lay ahead. Renewal was spatial as well as temporal. Homes breathed again, tools were checked, paths were cleared. Lives that had been narrowed by cold began to widen. This widening influenced cooperation too. In many hunter-gatherer societies, winter's depth created social contraction. Families or small bands dispersed to reduce strain on resources. When daylight grew, these groups reassembled. Ethnographic parallels suggest that such reunions were not merely practical but deeply symbolic. The sun gathered strength, and so did the community. Shared meals, shared stories, and shared decisions emerged from this seasonal clustering, and over time these gatherings shaped expectations about belonging. Renewal was therefore not just about the environment turning, it was about human relationships resetting, recovering their structure after the fragmentation imposed by winter. The returning light also influenced how people recognized continuity between generations. In some early cultures, the moment of daylight's first noticeable increase marked the time when elders retold genealogies, when children were reminded of ancestral names, when communities paused to reflect on who had survived the cold. Survival through winter was not taken for granted. It created a sense of lineage preserved, of knowledge carried forward. Linguistic evidence from several northern Eurasian traditions links the words for year, cycle, and people in ways that hint at this connection. The sun returned, and thus the story of the group continued. The two ideas were inseparable. In many regions, renewal also shaped how landscapes were understood. The first places to receive the strengthening light, ridges, clearings, riverbanks, often became associated with beginnings. Archaeologists studying prehistoric movement routes observed that paths taken in early spring remained significant across centuries. These were the lines the returning sun illuminated first, and so they became the lines people followed. Renewal therefore imprinted itself on geography. The sky's transformation left measurable traces on the ground. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of renewal, however, lies in how quietly it operated. Myths would later develop dramatic accounts of the sun's triumph, but the earliest traces suggest something far gentler, an acknowledgement of continuity earned rather than given. Communities watched the sky and saw not victory but persistence. They saw the world regain balance, slowly, predictably, without grandeur. And in that predictability lay comfort, a comfort sturdy enough to be passed down through memory long before it appeared in myth. Over generations, this subtle reassurance became tradition. With each return of the sun, people confirmed that the pattern held, that the world still followed its ancient rhythm, that life could proceed again. Renewal was not a single moment. It was the steady unfolding of days, the quiet rebuilding of confidence, the shared recognition that, once more, the year was beginning. A tale whispered beside a winter fire in a small valley, spoken in a language no longer remembered, lit only by embers and the faint promise of dawn. Now imagine a remarkably similar tale taking shape thousands of miles away, carried not by travellers or traders, but by the simple fact that another community, facing the same dimming of the world, looked up at the same weak midwinter sun and felt the same quiet fear. It is here, in this parallel response to darkness, that the story of the solar child begins to echo across civilizations. What if I told you that long before cultures could influence one another through roads, script or empire, their earliest narratives had already begun to rhyme? When we trace the oldest layers of solstice-shaped myth across continents, the surprising pattern is not how much was shared, but how much was reinvented. The evidence from archaeology, comparative mythology, and linguistic reconstruction points toward a phenomenon scholars call independent invention, the spontaneous emergence of similar stories in societies separated by geography, time, and ancestry. The reason, the data suggests, is practical rather than mystical. Ecological pressures, especially those tied to seasonal extremes, act almost like narrative templates. Where winters were long or daylight sharply reduced, communities created stories in which light became fragile. Where the seasons reversed or monsoons dominated, the emphasis shifted, but the structural longing for renewal remained. The conditions differed, but the underlying need did not. We can see this most clearly in regions with no documented contact before the modern era. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, stories of faint early light appear independently of Eurasian influences, associated with seasonal rains and agricultural timing, rather than snow or deep cold. In the Andes, highland narratives describe the sun as a being who must travel through immense danger during the darkest period of the year, even though their environment lacks the long polar night of the far north. Among some indigenous groups of North America, the returning light is woven into stories that emphasize the resilience of small creatures enduring winter scarcity. Each of these traditions rises from different ecologies, yet they converge around the same structural idea. Light is born weak, becomes endangered, and returns stronger. This circle is not the result of shared theology, but the consistent rhythm of the Earth's orbit inscribed into human experience. The more we examine these parallels, the more cautious we must be. Not every resemblance signals a deep, ancient connection. Many comparative studies warn that similarities may emerge purely because societies are responding to analogous environmental challenges. Yet linguistic contact zones provide an additional layer of insight. In regions where communities did interact, such as across the Eurasian steppe, or along early coastal exchange routes, we see how motifs could travel while still adapting to local conditions. A metaphor from one linguistic family shifts shape as it passes into another, carrying the skeleton of a story while changing its ornaments. These contact networks create what scholars sometimes describe as mythic drift, a blending of inherited logic with local meaning. But even in these zones, the underlying solstice pattern is rarely borrowed wholesale. It is recognised, interpreted or repurposed because it already resonates with an existing seasonal framework. Archaeological evidence reinforces this independence. Iconography associated with early solstice narratives appears in contexts far too early or too isolated to be traces of diffusion. The symbols at Sat al Hoyuk and the carvings on Scandinavian rock faces cannot be linked by any plausible contact route in their earliest phases. The circular motifs in North African engravings emerge without known Eurasian influence. The midwinter ritual sequences reconstructed from pre-Columbian sites in Mesoamerica develop along a different historical trajectory, yet mirror the same fundamental logic of renewal. Data sets that map narrative structures onto climate zones show that regions with similar latitudinal daylight patterns tend to generate similar motifs, regardless of cultural lineage. These findings challenge older theories that assumed all similarities must come from a single ancestral tradition. Instead, they point to the remarkable human capacity to notice patterns in the sky and give them structure through story. As civilizations grew, these local solstice narratives proved unexpectedly durable. Empires rose and fell, scripts changed, religions codified new cosmologies, yet the motif of weak, returning light persisted. We find it embedded within far later texts, sometimes hidden beneath layers of theological reinterpretation, sometimes preserved explicitly in festival timing. Oral traditions that survived colonial disruption or long historical silence still carry versions of a newborn light protected against darkness or obstacles. This continuity is not evidence of unbroken transmission across tens of thousands of years, but of something far simpler and more profound. The sky repeats itself, and humans respond in kind. The realization, then, is that the solar child appears not because cultures borrowed from one another, but because the sun itself offered the same lesson everywhere. Light diminishes, life becomes uncertain, and then, slowly and predictably, brightness returns. That rhythm is older than writing, older than agriculture, older even than many of the mythic languages reconstructed by scholars. It is the most dependable message the earth gives to anyone who watches. And even as civilizations changed, the oldest myth remained. It is in this parallelism, detectable only when one steps far enough back from the archaeological details, that another subtle pattern emerges. When researchers chart the distribution of these motifs on large comparative maps, they find that mythic structures are rarely evenly spread. Instead, they cluster in arcs that mirror ancient migration corridors, ecological boundaries and trade pathways. Yet within these arcs, the solar child story appears not as a borrowed fragment, but as an adaptation that re-emerges whenever people depend on a predictable seasonal transition. The presence of similar story logic in communities separated by oceans long before transcontinental contact becomes intelligible when viewed through this ecological lens. The sky itself, steady in its motions, provided the same problem and the same reassurance, prompting convergent answers in entirely different cultural languages. Archaeologists studying the distribution of midwinter ceremonial sites in the Americas, for example, have noted that similar patterns often arise where climate pressures align. In the high plateaus of the Andes, where nights lengthen dramatically and agricultural scheduling is precarious, early traditions describe a vulnerable light struggling upward through cold weeks. Thousands of kilometers away, in parts of northern Eurasia, unrelated cultures describe the sun as a small being who survived winter by retreating to the horizon. These images are not identical, and they do not require historical connection to resemble one another. They stem from the same environmental tension, knowing that survival depends on the sun's return, but living through long periods in which that return felt uncertain. This does not imply that all similarity is coincidence. Linguists and anthropologists do identify instances of transmission, particularly in regions where long-term contact zones existed. But the persistence of the solar child, even in areas without any known lines of communication, points to something deeper, something grounded in the earliest relationship between humans and the celestial rhythm governing warmth, food, mobility and safety. When the mechanisms of the sky were not yet explained by cosmology or calculation, they were explained by narrative. People made sense of the returning light not only through observation but through metaphor, pairing the cycle of days and seasons with the cycle of vulnerability and maturation, familiar from human life. Some of the most compelling evidence for independent invention comes from cultural layers, in which the solar motif appears only after communities settle into environments with strong seasonal contrasts. Oral traditions recorded among groups entering such zones for the first time often show a shift toward myths of struggle and renewal, correlating with their adaptation to new climatic rhythms. Over generations, these stories stabilize, accumulating characters, conflicts and ritual behaviours that reflect local concerns. But beneath the details, the underlying arc remains consistent. The fragile light returns, grows, overcomes its seasonal adversary and renews the world. The archaeological record reinforces this narrative resilience. Even as tools, settlement patterns and material technologies change drastically across millennia, the symbolic associations between winter scarcity and the promise of returning light remain remarkably durable. All of this suggests that the solar child is not merely a mythic figure, but a cognitive response shaped by repeated experience. In every place where winter constrains the human horizon, myth becomes a framework for interpreting time, risk, and continuity. The figure of the child serves as a mirror of the human condition itself, small, endangered, dependent on forces outside one's control. And when that child grows stronger in the stories as the days lengthen outside the shelter walls, people witness a parallel between their imagined cosmos and the natural world, binding them to the cycles that define their survival. It is in this resonance, repeating across landscapes and eras, that the universality of the myth becomes visible, not as a borrowed idea, but as the oldest shared human intuition about the sky. And with that intuition came the realization that even as cultures rose and fell, the oldest structure of all was the one that required no stones, no writing, and no monuments to endure, the returning light itself. Picture a moment when the oldest story you know does not come from a book or a lesson or a lineage, but from something as simple as looking up on the coldest morning of the year and noticing that the sun has returned a little earlier than yesterday. Imagine standing in that quiet in a world without clocks or calendars or written explanations, where the only certainty is the memory of how dark the previous weeks had been. In that silence, the returning light was not just a physical event. It was reassurance. It was continuity. It was the first proof that a world slipping toward darkness could find its way back. And it is here, in this experience shared by countless communities who never met and never exchanged beliefs, that the most enduring myth of humanity takes shape, the fragile light that emerges from winter's depth and grows into a season of abundance. Scholars who study the persistence of seasonal narratives across civilizations note that midwinter remains one of the most universally marked moments in the human year. From the 4th millennium before the Common Era onward, archaeological layers show evidence of gatherings, feasts, fire rituals and symbolic renewals clustered around this point in the solar cycle. Even as cultures diversified, migrated and reshaped their symbolic worlds, the timing remained consistent, a moment near the year's turning, when communities acknowledged the shift from decreasing light to increasing light. The festivals changed their names, languages, and rituals, but not their underlying function. They were occasions for pausing, for recalibrating seasonal expectations, for reaffirming that time itself remained trustworthy. In written traditions from the first millennium before the Common Era, echoes of far older stories surface in new symbolic frameworks. Texts from regions as distant as northern Europe and southwest Asia contain metaphors of light born or renewed at midwinter. Scholars argue that these literary traces are not direct survivals of Paleolithic narratives, but reinterpretations of a cognitive pattern that had already existed for tens of thousands of years. Once writing emerged, it simply provided a new surface onto which the old intuitions could be inscribed. What had once been told beside fires or illustrated through seasonal ceremonies became codified in scripts that could circulate across regions and centuries. Yet the core idea remained. The sun diminishes, the world trembles in darkness, and then, in the quiet of midwinter, light returns. Modern languages keep fragments of these ancient associations in ways most speakers never notice. Phrases like light at the end of the tunnel, a new dawn, after darkness, light, and hope rising appear in dozens of linguistic families with no direct historical connection. Comparative linguists observe that metaphors linking light to renewal, insight, and survival emerge repeatedly, even in societies where winters are mild or where solar cycles are less dramatic. These metaphors are so deeply rooted that they shape emotional vocabulary, moral imagery, and everyday expressions. In many cultures, the word for good or pure originates in terms related to brightness, while words for harm, fear, or danger trace back to roots connected with obscurity or darkness. These linguistic fossils preserve a worldview in which the contrast between diminishing and returning light provided the fundamental template for meaning. The persistence of winter festivals adds another layer of continuity. Many of the world's major cultural traditions maintain midwinter celebrations, often without conscious awareness of their deeper prehistoric origins. These festivals may revolve around religious observances, historical commemorations, or social gatherings, yet their timing remains anchored to the winter solstice or its surrounding days. Anthropologists emphasize that such festivals function as annual markers of transition, moments when communities reset their temporal frameworks and reaffirm solidarity in the face of environmental uncertainty. The forms have changed. Feasting replaces fasting, lights replace fires, communal rituals replace solitary watching. But the underlying impulse, to acknowledge the return of light, is unchanged. Even in regions where seasonal cycles are inverted or less pronounced, the symbolic logic endures. Societies in equatorial zones, which experience relatively consistent day length, still employ metaphors of rising light and emerging dawn to describe renewal. Some traditions that developed far from strong winter-summer contrasts incorporate celestial events such as monsoons, dry seasons, or agricultural cycles, yet retain the imagery of a small, fragile light becoming strong. This suggests that once the metaphor became central to human cultural imagination, it outlived its original environmental triggers. The idea of light returning from darkness became a portable framework, adaptable to contexts far removed from the long winters that first gave it emotional weight. Archaeological continuity strengthens this interpretation. Burials, offerings, and ceremonial deposits clustered around midwinter continue well into historical periods. At sites from the 4th century of the Common Era and beyond, ceremonial architecture still aligns with the solstice, even after the rise of religions that introduce complex cosmologies. Temples, shrines, and sacred spaces maintain orientations that track the sun's path. The persistence of such alignments suggests that the solstice retained symbolic significance long after it ceased to serve purely practical functions. It had become hereditary, a cultural memory encoded in stone. Over time, the solar child evolved into a broader metaphor of human resilience. Instead of representing literal daylight, it became a figure of personal renewal, the promise of new beginnings, the reassurance that cycles of hardship contain within them the possibility of transformation. Myths carried this message into epic literature, moral teachings, and later philosophical systems. Even when stripped of explicit cosmological content, the structure remained recognizable. We still tell stories of figures who fall into darkness and rise again, who begin in weakness and gain strength, who reflect the slow shift from winter scarcity to the fullness of spring. These narrative arcs appear in novels, films, modern spiritual traditions, and cultural celebrations, demonstrating the extraordinary longevity of the pattern first shaped by prehistoric observers standing in the cold. The endurance of this myth does not require mystical explanations. It persists because the solstice persists. Once each year, regardless of language or religion or political boundaries, the sun reaches its lowest arc, pauses, and begins to climb again. This physical motion repeats with such reliability that it becomes not only an astronomical fact, but a psychological anchor. People living thousands of years ago and people living now experience the same reassurance when daylight begins to return. The continuity of the sky creates continuity of meaning, and the fragile light that once determined the difference between hardship and survival now shapes the way we speak about hope, recovery, and renewal. The oldest myth survives because the world continues to perform it in front of us. Long before gods or scriptures, people looked into winter's darkness, saw the faintest light returning, and made it the first story they ever learned to tell.